Taking a look at some of the major averages here as we're about 31 minutes into trade on this Thursday or Friday's Eve for you folks. S&P 500, we're holding on to gains here intraday of about 0.8%. And then additionally here, checking in on the NASDAQ composite, tech-heavy average, you're seeing that up by about 1% right now. And then just lastly, let's round things out with the major averages. Taking a look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, you're seeing that up on the day by about 0.4%, holding on to some gains there. Switching over to some of the sector activity that we've also been keeping an eye on. This is the banks, and I'll come back to that in a hot second. But first and foremost, this is where we're seeing things really shape out right now. You've got more advancers than decliners for certain here. Utility is really the only one that's in negative territory here. And I want to zero in on financials for a brief moment here as you're seeing the Financial Select Sector Fund, or the XLF, you're seeing that up by about 1% right now, and then just diving back into some of those banks that really round out the financials as well. You're seeing JPM, Bank of America as well, up by about 1.4, 1.5% here, respectively, on the day. And keep a close eye on those going into the Fed's big annual conference, the 3-day conference here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that's taking place. And speaking of which, let's get an update from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and this 3-day extravaganza. Fed Chair Jay Powell expected to talk inflation and interest rates. Joining us live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, we've got Brian Cheung. Yahoo
Finance
Plus.
You took the hat off.
Yeah, where's the hat?
I did. Well, it's actually not all that sunny yet. I did have to put my fleece back on, though, because it is still pretty chilly out here. But, like as you guys mentioned, a lot of attention on this Jackson Hole conference so far. The big speech expected tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern time, 8 a.m. local time. Now, we don't really know what's in that speech beyond the fact that it will be some sort of economic outlook. Usually the Fed chair uses the opportunity here in Jackson Hole to make an update in terms of how he is viewing the state of the economy. And the stakes are really high right now, with inflation, even though maybe plateauing on a month-over-month basis in that July CPI report. The Fed has made it clear they want to be resolute in making it clear that there's going to be more interest rate hikes to get ahead of that issue. Now, when do they stop that point in time? That's something that markets are trying to figure out. That's the reason why there's going to be so much focus on that speech. We had the chance to speak with Kansas City Fed President Esther George yesterday, and she was essentially saying that the Fed will be data dependent during this time, which has the benefit of flexibility for Fed policymakers, but the detriment of a lack of clarity for markets as to what the Fed's next moves might be. For what it's worth, markets pricing in a larger chance than not of the Fed going by 75 basis points in their next meeting in late September. Of course, a lot can happen between now and then. Another CPI print. We'll have another print actually on PCE tomorrow on inflation, and then also another jobs report. So very noisy, but a lot of attention on what's going on here in the Grand Teton Mountains.
Yeah, most definitely. Let's talk about a little bit about the vibe out there, right? You've got now Fed governors who are starting to arrive. Obviously, you talked to Esther George and other folks from the media who are starting to arrive. Can you talk to us a little bit about the chatter or the kind of, vibe, for lack of a better word, of people out there, especially now that you've got a few of these under your belt compared to other years?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, this is the first in-person Jackson Hole event since the beginning of the pandemic. You'll recall that, obviously, in addition to the 2020 event being canceled, the 2020 event was abruptly canceled last minute, even though they were planning on holding it in person, and then ultimately pulled the plug a few days beforehand. When it comes to this particular meeting, there is, of course, the excitement about all these policymakers being back in person, being able to shake hands, being able to be out here in the beautiful mountain. I mean, look at it outside. It's gorgeous, right? But at the same time, it does come at a time of increased, heightened sensitivity to what's happening in the economy, simply because of the fact that with these recession risks and Americans experiencing the high prices at the store on a daily basis, this is something the Federal Reserve needs to get ahead of, especially when you consider the contrast to the Fed speech that we got virtually at the Jackson Hole meeting last year, where Fed Chair Jay Powell used the T word, transitory, many times, insisting that the higher price pressures that we were seeing were simply the result of these temporary factors that were going to fade away. Some elements of that speech haven't really aged all that well, so it's possible the Fed chair could use this speech this year to try to clarify and maybe back up a little bit on what he said last year, with the T word having been retired earlier this year and at the end of last year. So a lot of fixation, a lot of sensitivity, but again, still a lot of excitement as well. But of course, Americans very interested in seeing how the Fed is going to respond, again, with inflation being the number one top priority.
Yes, I think that is true almost universally. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Brian.